Okay, good. Now we're live on YouTube, and so I'll bring everybody in. Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction. My name is Colin Mustful. I'm the founder and editor of History Through Fiction, a small independent press that publishes historical novels. What's New in Historical Fiction is a regular panel series where it features historical novelists with new and upcoming titles. So we have 4 authors today with brand new titles, and I'm really excited to talk to them about their stories and to share them with all of you. Thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate the support that we get from events like these, and we're really glad to have you tonight. Just a couple quick notes. You can turn your mics on and off, or I'm sorry, you can turn your cameras on and off. You will not be able to turn your mics on just to limit the distractions. However, I would love if you could use the chat to say hello, to ask questions, let us know where you're joining us from. Anything and everything is good in the chat. I will invite questions from the audience a little bit later in the panel, so keep those ready. And you can post those as we get towards the end of the event, and I'll facilitate questions there. I also want to share a link to a landing page with all of our panelists' novels. I just put it in the chat. And if you go there, you can find each of our panelists' novels with a synopsis and a link to bookshop.org. We support bookshop.org because they give a percent of the sales to independent bookstores. So without further ado, I'm going to remove myself from the screen and we'll welcome our panelists. If Kristy Cambron, author of The French Kitchen, if you could say hello and let us know about your novel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristy Cambron. Great to be here tonight. Lovely to see everyone here. I write historical fiction for HarperCollins, and this is my 11th novel, The French Kitchen. And it's essentially about an American expat who was a former spy during World War II who crosses paths with a young Julia Child when she's just getting started in her cooking classes in 1950s Paris. And it complicates the high society world that this American expat has built to hide her past. And so we've got a little bit of spies and intrigue. And as always with me, I always include some form of art history. You can see the artists behind me on my shelves. They're all color coded. If you read my books, you're going to get strong female characters and some form of art that intersects with history. So that's a little bit about me and this book, The French Kitchen.
Thank you so much, Kristy. Heather, welcome. If you could say hello and let us know about your novel, Amanda.
Hi, yeah, I'm Heather Cross, or HS Cross, as it is on the. We'll put it over. There we go. As it is on the cover. My novel is. Trying to get it in focus here? There we go. Amanda, and this is my third novel, and I don't know if I should hold it up here. I'm gonna set it down now. And this is. It's a literary love story, and it's set in 1926 England. And it's very much in the shadow of the First World War, and also of kind of the Easter Uprising and all the conflicts that are going on in Ireland. And the male lead is English and the female lead is Irish. And so that's the conflict in the love story and the setting that they're in.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Heather. Jill Hall, if you could say hello and let us know about On a Sundown Sea.
Hi. On a Sundown Sea, a novel of Madame Tingley and the origins of Lomaland. It's biographical historical fiction, so I've spent 5 years researching it and writing it. So in 1888, Catherine Tingley is serving her immigrants in lower Manhattan, and she meets a man who meets her, and he sees her potential, and he turns out to be the head of the Theosophical Society, and then he becomes her teacher, and he teaches her all about theosophy, and he shows her there is a path to being able to have her vision of a white city on a sundown sea that she's had since childhood, and that it could become a reality.
All of that is new to me. I had not heard of any of it until I took a look at your novel, so I'm excited to learn more in a little bit. And finally, Jillian Forsberg, whose novel, The Porcelain Menagerie, is published by us, History Through Fiction. Jillian, if you could say hello and let us know about your novel.
Hi, so this is The Porcelain Menagerie, a companion to my first novel, The Rhino Keeper, based on the true story of a mad king in Saxony, Germany, who decided that animals, people, and art were all objects that should be kept close by him and by no one else. The story of a porcelain maker and one of his mistresses.
Thank you so much, Jillian. Kristy, if we could go back to you, you
Sure.
have a dual timeline with the French kitchen that aren't separated by a lot of time. Can you talk about why you wrote it that way and how the timelines connect?
Yeah, I think this is such a fun question because I get the opportunity to talk about this story that I love so much, but also to scare people a little bit. And what I mean by that is my favorite TV show of all time is Lost. And if that tells you a little bit about the way that I write and the way that I look at story, it is all about the characters. And so to have a split time story, I want to give you, the reader, an opportunity to understand the character. What's the motivation? So for the main character in this book, it's Kat, and she has a World War II storyline, and this comes straight from real female spy stories in World War II, like the Virginia Halls. And if you look in the back of the book, there is actually a reading guide that has a number of books that incorporate these real histories. But then also, I love to take these pockets of history that I knew nothing about and then wrap a story around it. And say a couple years ago now, I heard a podcast. If anyone out there listens to podcasts, I heard a podcast, The History Chicks. If anyone's heard of this one, pop your hand up virtually. It's all about women in history. And they had a story about Julia Child. And they talked about her being a spy, a quote, spy in the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which became the CIA. I knew nothing about this. And so I picked up a couple of books. I'll tell another story in a second about that. But this is Julia Child's memoir. And so to have a split time story, it really gives you an understanding when Kat, our main character, meets up with Julia Child. And this is all historically accurate right from Julia Child's memoir. When they meet up in Paris, I really want to give the reader a look back, and we're trying to untangle this story from the past that informs how the characters are responding today. So for me, split time is really the perfect way to do that, to give us a character-driven narrative wrapped around one of those pockets of history that I think is just fascinating, and to amplify strong female voices in history. So you get Julia Child. I hope everyone out there knows who she is. If not, get your phone out and start Googling, because she is fascinating.
So by setting it 10 years earlier, it kind of you can see the setup for how the characters are. I guess could you go a little bit more in depth of how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so for Kat, she is recruited into the American OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and frequently they would recruit siblings. And so her brother is recruited first, and I'm not giving any spoilers, it's on the back of the book, okay? But her brother is recruited first, and he actually goes missing in France. And so she's recruited as someone who has an education. She's a linguist. She actually grew up in her father's auto body garage, so she's also a mechanic, and she has something in her that actually would be seen as a disability, but it really becomes her superpower. She's deaf in one ear and she learns to read lips. And so you have all of these skills taken together. She's recruited into World War II. And then, as we see in the story, 10 years later, it's starting to unfold when she meets Julia Child in Paris in 1950s post-war. And it starts to untangle these experiences that she had as a spy working as a chef in a Nazi-controlled chateau in northern France. And so to intertwine the stories, for me, it's just really a fun way to give the reader introspection into what happened in this character's past and what is she trying to find out? What is she trying to figure out? And for Kat, it's what happened to her brother during World War II. And because Julia Child worked in the OSS as well, we get those stories crossing in a really unique way.
Nice. So she's really able to utilize that skill set.
Yeah, absolutely.
Heather, let's talk about your book and your characters, Marion and Jamie. Where do they find themselves at the outset of this novel? You said it was 1926 England, is that right?
That's right. Yeah. They're in London, and I said at the beginning it's a literary romance. So as the story opens, they're apart. They had been together a few years earlier, and then there was a split, and so we're at the kind of boy has lost girl phase of the love story. But Jamie, they're both in their 20s. He's about 28, she's 26. He's English. He's an Englishman, kind of this English public school, in other words, boys' private boarding school, Oxbridge type of class. And was an officer in the First World War and has survived it without being maimed or dead, which is sort of a feat. And his father is an Anglican bishop, and he's just been hired to be headmaster of a sort of third-rate um, boys' public school, which is where the previous two novels that I wrote are set in 26 and 31 at this boarding school in Yorkshire. So he's about to take it over. It takes place in the summer. And so in this summertime, he's getting ready to for this career, but he's trying to find Marion, who had vanished a year before, and now he knows she's back and she won't see him, and he doesn't know why. And Marion is from Ireland, from Galway. She grew up there, kind of middle class, and in 1918 fled Ireland after the death of her abusive husband, came to Oxford, which is where Jamie was a student, was working at a printing press. And then a year before the story begins, she flees to Switzerland and then comes back. And in the present moment, she's a governess in London. So that's kind of where they find themselves. And a lot of the um, action of the engine of the love story is sort of working through all of these obstacles. Most of them are internal, and reckoning with their own past together and separately, and all of the difficult things that they've been through. And instead of it being kind of this dual storyline or something like that, it's really a spiral. And meaning that they come back to similar events again, and the past and the present are really porous together. And that to me was how the human mind works. And also when you meet someone, you don't get the original story right until you know them better, even if it's the first thing that happens. So it was sort of an organic structure that way.
Um, so that's sounds like a very rich for character type of, character driven novel. I'm curious what inspired you how did you find these characters? How did you meet these characters and decide to write this story?
Well, I met them from the other books. They were together in one of the other books, although minor characters, and a lot of the other points of view characters in the other books like hated her and thought why would he ever marry her? And I thought, well, I don't know, why would he marry her? And then as I got to writing her, she was one of those characters that just was like a live wire immediately the very first time I met her on the page. And I was like, wow, I had this all wrong. She's amazing. It's a really sparky relationship. This is so hot and no one knows about it. It's so secret to them. So that was that. But in the end, I really loved that period. I love that interwar period in Britain. It's so transitional. Um, and for the two of them, a lot of the trying experiences are, I don't know, I try to avoid the word trauma because it's so overused, but traumas that they have been through personally, some of them are shared with the society, like the war, Ireland, and some of them are just very personal to them. But they're living at a time when everyone has suffered something catastrophic. And that was kind of exciting and not as isolating as those things could be. So there's a lot I liked about the period for them and the way that it informed their very private, personal stories. But that's just a start.
Let's go next to Jill. Um, so you have this book about Catherine Tingley, William Q. Judge, and a place called Loma Land. Am I saying that right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay, so tell us about who those people are, and I'm really curious to know about Lomaland.
Lomaland is right here near where I live. And I grew up with rumors about who Catherine Tingley was and what happened there. And so I just wanted to know what was the truth. Supposedly, she was a medium and a clairvoyant. She grew up in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and her father was appalled that she had these visions, and he thought she was making up these stories. But her grandfather, who was a Mason and also a transcendentalist, he believed in her and really helped her to find that she could maybe someday find that path. And so William Judge is the founder of one of the founders of the Theosophical Society. And so after he was her teacher, and after he passes, she becomes the head of the Theosophical Society. And through all sorts of esoteric and coincidental and synchronistic ways, she finds out that where Lomaland is supposed to be. And it's a barren place in San Diego, California, in Point Loma. And so she moves in 1900, moves the New York Theosophical Society headquarters to San Diego and starts a school and a big community. At one point, there were 500 people living there and 500 acres. Wow. So it's pretty wild.
And tell me, I feel a little ignorant, but what is
Theosophy. So when I started this
Okay.
research, I had no idea how to say it, pronounce it either. So,
Okay.
So it is based on ancient wisdom and esoteric truths, and also the unity of all religions. And it's a philosophy, not a religion. And it's focused also on reincarnation and karma, and humanitarianism and brotherhood of man.
And how strong is that philosophy today?
Well, evidently, I didn't know when I started either. There are thousands of theosophists still all over the world. And so there is a community. They just had a big conference in Vancouver, Canada, where people came from all over the world to meet. And one of my subject matter experts was on a panel there. So I've learned a lot about everything having to do with theosophy and Lomaland. And it's been very exciting to be able to share that in my novel.
Yeah, wow. You mentioned a subject matter expert. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later in the panel. But let's go to Jillian. Jillian, I published your book. I've now heard you speak about it several times. I know, so I want to try to get a new angle. So you have Johann and Fatima in this dual timeline. I wonder if you can kind of, well, first of all, for those who don't know, tell us who they are. But I'm curious, because their timelines intertwine so much and their stories or narratives are somewhat alike in that they're both under the thumb of King Augustus of Saxony, but also how are their stories different?
Sure. So Fatima Kahraman was a real woman living in the 16th the 1600s and 1700s. She was stolen as a child as a war prize, and she was about 5 years old from Turkey, which is absolutely devastatingly sad for us to think about. She was passed around from royal to royal, essentially as an object, until she landed in the court of Augustus the Strong. Augustus the Strong really liked her, and she had two of his bastard children, and she got a lot of beautiful things, but lived quite a sad life. A historian who wrote about her said that anything that could be written could be true because there's so little known about this woman who had the king's bastard children, and that just gripped me the moment that I heard it. Johann Kändler, if anyone knows anything about porcelain, is one of the finest porcelain sculptors in history. He was basically the best sculptor in Meisen's porcelain's factory for about 50 years, honestly. And they were both under the thumb of King Augustus because King Augustus wanted things from them. From Fatima, you can guess what he wanted. He wanted her to bow to his every whim and fulfill all of his desires. For Johann, he wanted something no king could have, and that was white gold, which was porcelain. They were the same because they couldn't always provide what the king had in mind. They were different because being a man and being an artist under a king's thumb, where you have a goal and a place, and you have wares that you can sell, and you have a tangible skill set that is seen as valuable outside of just the king himself's opinion. That's hugely important for anyone who's not born into royalty. But Fatima, as a woman whose skill set was seen as something more like a handmaiden, her story to me is much more tragic because as many of us know, when we read about the past in A King's Mistress, there's very little that she could do to prove her worth as a person besides what she did for him. So by intertwining those two stories, both of which have great ambition, great hope, and honestly, a twinge of sadness mixed in with anger, frustration, and wanting something more from your life, mostly wanting to be remembered. Both of those people have the same goals, but yielded very different results.
Mm.
And do you feel like you're now helping them be remembered?
I hope so. I like to write about obscure people, which can be somewhat complicated because, as all historical fiction authors know, when you're doing research on a real person or one that's imagined, you really try and get into the mind of that person. And it's difficult with especially Fatima because she didn't leave behind written record. And it's difficult with the porcelain maker himself because what he left behind was art. And so I had certain things that I could tell from what they leave behind, but reality is that when we write about people from the past that are not royal or famous, like Julia Child has so many sources, it was probably hard for Kristy to take that and say, oh, I know exactly what to write about her, because it becomes more difficult at that point. There's this fine line between I would love someone who's no one has ever heard of, and I would love for them to have written something more about their lives so that I actually have some source material. Um, so for me, I hope that I continue forward, but I think sometimes just by saying their names aloud for those obscure historical characters, we do hope their legacies live on.
Thank you, Jillian. Kristy, let's go back to your novel. I'm curious, you talked about, well, obviously, as Jillian just mentioned, Julia Child is in it, and there's a lot of real history here.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the real history that it's based on, and then how it goes off from history to create a fictional narrative?
Yeah, I can. But real quick, I want to respond to what Jillian said because I really loved the way that she said that about these figures of history that sometimes they are obscure. And I love how you put that. I wrote a novel about Mabel Ringling, John and Mabel Ringling in the circus in the Golden Age in the late 1920s and the Jazz Age. And there are very few resources about Mabel Ringling. She was notoriously reticent with the press. She gave only like 2 interviews in her whole lifetime. And so there was very little source material, but aha, ding, 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 that's where authors jump in and we get to fictionalize it. We get to wrap a story around it. So Jillian, you are exactly right with that. We do have a little bit more about Julia Child. We have, I think it's like, I don't know, 6 or 10 seasons of her cooking show on PBS. I mean, so you can go to YouTube right now, friends, and you can watch The French Chef. But this is one of the books, the source books that I had for Julia Child, and it's As Always Julia. And I'm holding it up because everyone here, I know that you love history, I know that you love fiction, and you love people in history, and we write fiction about them. So this might be a book you want to pick up. But this is where I got the idea to actually write the novel. It kind of sad 2 seconds of sad at the beginning. I was getting over COVID. And so I was a couple of weeks out from that. And I had listened to that podcast about Julia Child, found her fascinating. And so we were actually out of town at a basketball camp for our oldest son. I took our 2 youngest sons to the hotel pool, kind of, like collapsed in the deck chair. And I was reading this book. And I opened to, and I'm going to try to show everyone, if you can see this photograph of Julia Child in her Paris flat in the early 1950s, and she was 6'2", so she's in wedge heels. Okay, so she's probably about 6'5" in that photo, and she is stirring a pot on this little stove. And I saw that photograph, and it was almost like the hair on the back of my neck stood up. And I set the book aside. I picked up my phone and I started just mad typing this short summary. I texted it to my agent and I said, here you go. And she texted back and said, where did you get this? And that's kind of how I read it. And I said, well, I just wrote it just 5 minutes ago. And she said, you're going to write this. This is going to be your next book. And it became The French Kitchen. And so for me to incorporate this love of something that was related to art, which is the culinary arts, I love to eat. So this worked really great for me to write about French cuisine and food, and someone who was as fascinating as Julia Child before she was Julia Child. That's one of the things that I love to do in my novels, is to write about the person, write about them before they're famous, before they were the legend. So write about her as a friend, as a coach, as a mentor in the classroom, if you will, in the culinary arts for our main character, Kat. And so for me, research is really my favorite thing. If I can learn from someone, if I can travel, if I can go to a museum, if I can read all the books that are out there. For that Ringling book that I mentioned, I went to the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art that's in Sarasota, Florida. It's there for all of us, and their mansion is still there. And over 95% of the furnishings are as they were in 1929 when Mabel Ringling designed the house. I mean, it's phenomenal that we get the opportunity to tell these stories and to really put a spotlight on some of these amazing people in history. And so for the research, I'm sure everyone here, all the other authors are going to echo, yes, we love the research. Yes, we love the history. That's why we're all here tonight. But that's a little bit about Julia Child. Lots of books, lots of videos. And like I said, you can start with her French chef cooking shows from the 1960s right on YouTube, on PBS.
Well, you have all that information, but can you talk a little bit about where the narrative diverges from the actual historical record?
Oh, yes, I can, Colin. And that is why we have author's notes in the back of the book. Because, yeah, absolutely. It does diverge from history. There was a very distinct window from January of 1952 to August 1952 in Julia Child's memoir. And I thought, okay, this is perfect. I can drop my character story right down into it. So the entire World War II storyline for the main character, the female spy, Kat, for the different people working with her, that is all fictional. So as far as I know, there is no one who met up with Julia Child in a World War II cookery class who was a former spy. But hey, it could have happened. I wasn't there. But all of the aspects of Julia Child written into this novel come directly from the memoir, down to the first meal that Julia Child has in France. That's in the book, down to all of the food that the first cooking classes after she graduated from Le Cordon Bleu in 1951, started her own cooking school, informal, for American expat wives in 1952. I include all of their meals that they would cook together. They did make bœuf bourguignon, which is a fancy French stew. They made coq au vin. They frequently made banana tarts. And in one of my book events, there's actually a woman who lived in Paris for many years, and she talked about how after the war, post-war, that bananas were actually kind of hard to find. And so I thought, well, that's interesting, because they did talk about making banana tarts. And so to be as historically accurate as possible, taking these original source materials and just dropping them into the novel, I do try to tell you in the author's note where we bend history a little bit, because that's always pretty important to me.
Sounds like you could really go into a lot of detail on exact type of food, all the little things. So that's incredible. I can't imagine how your notes must have looked like before writing the novel.
Yeah, and I had to do tons of research, which means eating macarons and eating French pastries. I mean, like, this is a really hard gig that we have here, but I had to do it for research purposes. I'm a worker, so I did it.
Oh, well, Heather, let's talk some more about Amanda. You have, would you call it a historical romance? And how does the romance fit into this history?
Yeah, it's interesting because hearing all of y'all talk about all of your research, and especially that there are real people that are figures in your stories, I feel like a little bit of an odd duck out in that the research that I did, I ended up just kind of blurring out all of the reality. So there's things that in these characters' backstory, like one person, Jamie, is captured and is in a German prison camp for a while. And I kind of lifted that experience from Alec Waugh's diary of being at the Citadel of Mainz. And also the kind of like war hospital stuff are sort of based on real people. But I always feel kind of intimidated with the real historical record of like, I'm never going to get it really right. So I just blur it and fictionalize it and just take it like that. But the romance, it is I kind of hesitate to call it a romance because it isn't a capital R romance, but it's a love story. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of the griefs that they have are shared with society at large. Um, but also, as they are trying to come together, they're coming together in a society where the roles of men and women have been really blown up by the war, and a lot of sort of just what Britain and Europe thought they were was destroyed by the war, all of that destruction. And so there's a sense of everybody kind of making up new values in a way or trying to rediscover what they are going to value, whether that's religion, whether that's relationships between men and women, um, and and also their relationship to their own personal past, but to a historical past. Like, does the disillusion and nihilism that's the response to the First World War, is that the dominant reality, or can there be hope? And when you meet someone and fall in love, there's a sense of hope. And so these two characters are wrestling with which of those are they going to really trust in, as they work through it. Does
Do
that
you,
sort of answer the question?
it does. It made me think if do you see any of that reflected today as we kind of reanalyze who we are and who our own histories?
Um, yes. I mean, I think that maybe people are always doing that. Um, I really, I was often asked, like, why don't you write in the present? Maybe your work would be so much more commercial if you just be in the present day or something. And I do also write in the present, but I've loved writing in this kind of modern feeling, but yet past time, because it gives a lot of permission to deal with things that don't have to then be really explained. Like, this is a time when kind of religious faith is taken as just a normal thing in society, although the characters are struggling with it, where marriage is just taken as a kind of default thing that you would probably do, where sex roles exist. And so I can just sort of deal with those things and without having to like sell it to the audience as a thing worth thinking about. Um, and I feel like I'm not so interested in what our time tells us about people in the past as much as when you inhabit a past society and a past point of view, what that shows us about us, like seeing us through their eyes in a way. And that's indirect. But yeah, I care a lot less about what we think about them than about what their life reveals about us.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. That's fascinating. I'm sorry, it looked like you might have had another thought on there.
No, no, I letting you carry on there.
Okay, no, that's wonderful. Well, Jill,
Oh, actually, the one thing I thought this was it made me Chrissy, when you were talking about the food, it was making me think like, well, how did I figure out their food? And one of the ways was I went to like the newspapers of the time, like the historical newspapers, and like looked at the recipes that they were, like
Love that.
and because all the food, it's England, and they're like at clubs, and it's all like it's just really horrible food. Like you'd probably not want to eat it, but I'm like, what are they having? And it's like, oh, it's a gelatin made of this, or it's a, and so I would just that's how I would know if it would, what kind of green beans would you have, and I lifted them from like just recipes in the paper.
Smart.
and it just really shows the work that all of you do to make your stories so authentic, so immersive. That's awesome. Jill, I want to ask you how you got interested in Loma Land and theosophy and like what inspired you to write this novel. And maybe you could then branch out and answer Valerie's question here in the chat about how long the research took you and how challenging it was to continue down the path to finally finishing the novel? Oops, let me unmute you here. There you go.
So I grew up nearby where Loma Land is now, which is part of Point Loma Nazarene University. So it's a university now. But I remember going down Catalina Boulevard, and my mom had all of us 4 kids in the station wagon, and she pointed to this building and she said, "See that round building? This kooky lady thought her husband had been reincarnated as a turtle. So he built it round so he wouldn't bump into the corners." So that's one of my earliest things that I've heard about Loma Land. And then I started to hear lots of rumors as I grew up that they had done lots of seances there, and that there were rituals that were unchristian, and that they were really wild. And so I decided I wanted to find out the truth. So I started researching, and as I first went to articles to look at articles in newspapers, old newspapers, and I found it was really difficult because there were lots of different things that one person would say one thing and another article would say another. And one time, when she first moved to Point Loma, to Loma Land, all of the clergymen got together and they started to preach against her and Loma Land and theosophy. And then also the Los Angeles Times started to print articles that were just horrible, saying that she was starving all the residents that lived there, and even putting them like in a prison and not letting them out. And I wanted to really I just felt like that just didn't feel right to me. And so I was able to, I couldn't even believe the paper. So I started to, just through different synchronistic ways, I met a gentleman whose parents actually grew up at Loma Land with Catherine Tingley. And he was, as I said, my main subject matter expert. And he really helped me understand what was real and what wasn't. And also from the reading, I found out that Theosophists they believed in reincarnation, but they felt once you were a human, you were always a human, that your soul came back as a human. So obviously the turtle story was not true. And but a lot of Asian religions do believe that you can come back as an animal. Valerie had a question, and research. So I spent 5 years researching, and it was really amazing. I wanted to know what her childhood was like. And she had grown up on a place called the Laurels in Newburyport, Massachusetts. So I contacted them there, the museum there and the library, and they'd never heard of her. So we were able to, I really wanted to go to the Laurels where she'd lived. So Sierra, who worked at the Old Newbury Museum, started to research. She called everybody, and she was able to find that it's now part of a state park. So when I went to visit, I actually got to hike out there to the Laurels, and we knew that it overlooked the ferry landing, and it's across the Merrimack River from Amesbury, which is where the poet John Greenleaf Whittier lived, and he was best friends with her grandfather. And so he used to come over and he wrote a poem called The Laurels, which is actually the Laurels where she had lived. And it's one of John Greenleaf Whittier's famous poems. And so I just kept studying and studying. The hardest thing for me to figure out, though, was where I was going to end it, because I kept writing and writing, and she lived till she was in her 80s. So I ended up working with a coach because I got really stuck. And I said, I really want this to end. I want it to end. And he said, okay, go ahead and write the ending at the last chapter. So I did. I wrote the chapter, and then all of a sudden I realized, hey, I'm almost there. So I was able to write what was in between. But as it is with biographical historical fiction, they do tend to be longer. And that's okay. But I wanted to be within. I didn't want to do a sequel. I wanted to get it out there in the world. So I wanted to dispel the rumors in the neighborhood. There still are a lot of rumors out here of what was happening there in the 1900s all the way through the 40s. And I'm excited to do my slideshow presentation and share with everybody exactly pretty much what was happening there. So, and who Madam Tingley was.
Well, it does sound like a lot of obstacles, but a lot of fun too. All of you get to have a lot of fun researching these novels. And what you just said remind me of what Jillian, don't you write the ending first all the time? Maybe you should start doing that, Jill, for every novel.
Well, but I always feel if I wrote the ending first, then I wouldn't want to keep writing because I like to find out what's going to happen. So it's great. We all have different styles of how we do it.
That's how I write as well. I write the first scene, then I write the last scene, then I write the middle.
Good for you. Maybe you guys don't take 5 years either. That's why we go so fast. But this is my fourth book, and the other books it's a trilogy. And when I started, I had no idea it was going to be a trilogy. It all kind of flowed out there. So yeah, but it's all great that we're so different in our styles.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Valerie, for that question. I want to invite more questions from the audience now. So if anyone has a question for our panelists, go ahead and post those in the chat. I'm going to post a link to that landing page one more time if you want to pick up one of these novels or just take a look at it a little bit further. Let's go next to Jillian. This might be kind of a selfish question. So Jillian published her debut novel with us, the Rhino Keeper, and it did well, and it was a 2025 Kansas Notable Book. I'm curious what you learned about the process, not just, we're not talking craft here, but what you learned about the process of getting a book out there that you were able to use for your second novel, The Porcelain Menagerie.
Well, I way overwrote The Rhino Keeper. I call my original version of it the director's cut because it's 148,000 words long, which is far too long for most people to want to take a look at it. And so I know now that sometimes if you need to write backstory, you can do that, but that might be for the author. And your reader may not need to know every single detail about your main character's childhood, but you might need to as an author so that you know their full motivations and things like that. So what I learned was write shorter books. So now all of my books are under 90,000 words, which I think has been helpful for me to just get to the point. The other thing that I learned is really that my skill set is within a time period that doesn't have cell phones. I find it much more enjoyable to write in a time period where there's no phones at all, actually. So I'm definitely like a pre-20th century type of person when I write. And I've also learned so much about what makes a compelling character and a compelling climax. And for me, I like to have a little darkness intertwined with the good in all of the histories that I find. And so I have to make sure that I have those moments of real drama and then a little humor or a little break or a little beauty for my readers to be able to go up and down the roller coaster ride with me. I've also realized that I don't think I'll ever be able to get away from writing about true stories. I'm brainstorming a couple ideas now, and one of them doesn't have a real historical figure in it yet. And I'm like, nope, I can't do it. I have to find a real historical figure, or I'm not ever going to be able to figure this out because I need to know who they were. So I think those are some of the things that I've learned. And I think the most valuable thing that I have learned is that you could write a book 5 years ago and it gets published 10 years later. Like it's all just so slow. But I think that means you have time to work on your craft and your next stories in between novels.
And you're using those lessons on future books, it sounds like.
Yes, I am. I have one in edits, one that is 20,000 words deep, one that is outlined, and one that, I always say this, is knocking at the door of my mind and it's never going to leave me alone. So
Do the rest of you... So Jillian just kind of outlined having several projects in the works. Do the rest of you work the same way or only one at a time? Anyone can
I'm working on my next novel now. It comes out in spring of 2027. It's not titled yet, but it's a take on, if you've seen the show Mad Men, it's a take on Mad Men meets Lessons in Chemistry. So it's about, it's inspired by a real person, Mary Wells Lawrence. She was just a trailblazer on Madison Avenue in the 1960s. She was the first female CEO on the New York Stock Exchange. And she came up with the tagline, I Heart New York. Amazing like that. And so this story is about a female CEO who comes in to take over an ad agency in the 1960s that typically caters to products for men. So I'm just having so much fun researching that whole Mad Men ad world. You've got sexism in the 1960s, you've got the racism, you've got everything that's going on. You're entering into Vietnam, you've got the fashion, you've got the culture, just everything is happening right now. So all that to say, I'm having a blast writing my next novel. I'm working on it right now.
Sounds
I'm
awesome.
working on a present day campus novel that's set at kind of one of those newly created, reimagined colleges. Sort of like what is the part of this conversation of like what is higher education, and so it's at an imaginary one of those that is like a throwback where they're sort of studying the matter of Britain and Anglo-Saxon literature and all that, but in Detroit, Michigan. So it's kind of set in the cradle, like the wastes of former Motown, but they're studying like ancient Lindisfarne or something. So that's my next project.
So for me, I feel like I need a break from novel writing. I've had in the last 10 years, I've had 4 books come out, and this last one just so I spent every second working on it for 5 years, and I really feel like I need a break. So I wanted to take some time, and I'd love to publish a anthology, a collection of my nature poems, and maybe write a book that's based on my philosophy and my blog posts, Creativity, the Art of Practicing a Creative Lifestyle. And so I don't want to ever write another novel. However, all of a sudden, the first chapter of my next story, if I was going to write it, from my series, would be the 4th book in that series. And my whole first chapter just came to whoosh, and I started writing and had to start writing. You can't wait. You've got to grab your journal and just get it going.
Yep.
And so it's there and it's waiting, and I'm just trying to push it aside because I want to have a life for a while.
Yeah, it's quite a commitment.
Yes.
Well, we've got a couple of questions here. Greg asks, historians write narratives and fiction authors write narratives. Do you find the two parallel closely? If not, which is more important for your work? So, I think there is a narrative structure in both, but obviously they're not the same. Anyone want to comment on that?
Well, for me, I feel like writing fiction is much more my style. I'm also a poet. And so if I was writing just straight history, I wouldn't be able to use my poetic language or let it flow the way I want it to. So I think that they're both really important because the history books that I did read in my research were really helpful. So I think they're both equally important. But for me, I'm definitely enjoy writing fiction.
I can speak to that too. So I have an undergraduate and a master's degree in history. And for me, all of the work that I did in my graduate degree and in my undergrad was writing historical narratives. And I often found that including plot and this actually storytelling, which is why we have history anyway. I mean, either it's oral storytelling or it's written document. We do find that telling true stories in a compelling way, whether that's through writing or literally just sitting around a campfire and telling how our grandfather crossed the Potomac, you know what I mean? Those things are done better in a passionate and energetic way. So I think that the question that we really have to ask ourselves is, am I telling history in a compelling enough way for my readers or my listeners in some circumstances, or even my child when I'm telling her about what I did in high school, to be able to listen to me in a way that makes her want to tell the story again when she is old enough to do so. They're intertwined, they're interchangeable, and for me, I can't separate one from the other.
Mm.
And I'll just add to that, I think it also depends a little bit on who the audience is. Because they all have their own kind of threshold for the narrative and what they're looking for. So if it's academic, you're going to have less narrative, but then there's narrative nonfiction where you intentionally, or creative nonfiction, intentionally adding some flowery prose and things like that that make it engaging. But as Jillian points out, like there's always a structure there. There's always a plot structure in some form, because that's what it's a human nature that engages us in the stories.
And I think, the novel is the literary form of the human being, of the human condition. And so when you're writing fiction, it's very much the personal story, often within in kind of bigger societal events, maybe what we would call history. And I think really good historical writing gets the human as well as the big sweeping events. But I think another challenge, and whether you're writing an historical account of a thing that really happened or you're writing fiction, is this question of when do you raise and lower the curtain in your story? In other words, where do you start and stop it? And that makes all the difference to what the story really is. Because I mean, history, it just keeps going back and forth, it never stops. And you're like, well, where would I raise the curtain and lower it? Like, what is the story I'll tell? And I think that the more you get into a fictional world, and this kind of goes to the you know your character's backstory, like I know all these people. I could start it years before, years after. Like what is the chunk that will be given to the reader in this novel? And so I feel like that's a common challenge.
I've always looked at historians as giving us information and maybe hoping we're entertained, and fiction authors entertaining us and maybe hope that we learn something. And so those are kind of two sides of the coin here when we're thinking about writing. I also went to school for history, so I have a degree in art history and research writing, and that was always the experience for me. It was reading books like Night by Elie Wiesel, or seeing the painting Guernica, like seeing that, but then peeling back the layers and really understanding and looking at the individual who created it, the culture that lived it, what was happening at that time, and trying to drill down and then wrap a story around what would it have looked like, sounded like, smelled like, felt like, tastes like to live in that experience. It's like the five senses. It's really inserting emotion into the human experience. And so, yeah, there are some historians who are great writers and they can entertain us. But I think in some ways, our goal is to entertain and hope that we can help someone learn something about the past. That's my take on it anyway.
I love that. I also think it's so important to include when you're talking about art, you have to see the art through the lens of the person who made it as well as through the lens of the viewer. And I
Yeah.
think that when we think about art, it becomes so public, like you think about Starry, Starry Night, and everyone can immediately conjure it in their minds. But what did it feel like when Van Gogh peeled his hand away and the paint was still there? So you have all these little things that you can incorporate as a writer that the person just viewing the painting could never see. And I absolutely love stepping back in time with art in that way. I think it's so important for us to viscerally feel it and smell the paint and know what it was like when he said he was finished or not. And that goes back to what Heather was saying. How do you know where to raise and lower the curtain? How do you know at what point? Like I was thinking about that right as she said, I said, well, when I tell a story to my daughter, I usually start with how old I was. Well, when I was in high school, but as a historical fiction writer, what's the right moment? And I think as readers, we all want to know that too, no matter what we're reading. Well, why do I care about this story? And I think it's because we all want to feel something akin to our own human emotions within every single word that we read, write, or every piece of art that we see in front of us too.
I'm going to watch all of this back. All of you have given so much great insight. This is fantastic. We have one more question. This is for Kristy, about the aspect of art in your books. What led you to write that type of historical fiction?
Yeah, when I was a girl, young girl, my mom used to take my sister and I to the library every week in the summer. And my sister would run to the fiction section, and I would go the other way. I would go to the art section. So 7, 8, 9 years old, I was pulling down thick volumes of art history and Disney animation books, and just sitting on the floor of the library and just thumbing through these volumes. But as a kid of the 80s and 90s, not to age myself, but there was no computer aided design at that point. If you wanted to be an artist, you had to have hands that could create. And I couldn't paint, I couldn't sculpt, I couldn't draw, I couldn't do anything conventionally to be an artist in the way that I wanted to. But I just knew I loved stories and I loved visual storytelling. So I did the thing that you're not supposed to do when you start college. I signed up for like a 300 or a 400 level art history class. I think it was something wild like Japanese art or something really hard, you know. And I walked in, and that was at Indiana University. And my professor was at the front of the room. And I just remember seeing the way that she talked with the students and the community. And I just felt this whisper on my heart, like, you're home. This is where you're supposed to be. And I had no idea, no clue that I was ever going to be an author. I just knew that I loved writing, I loved researching, and I loved stories. And what am I going to do with that? And it's funny now that I have these hands that can't paint or sculpt or draw. And we talk in my family, we say that now, okay, now it makes sense. I get to paint with words. So for me, there's always some form of art in my novels, be it ballet and the Italian ballerina. This novel right here is fashion houses during World War II, like Coco Chanel and so fashion, the Paris dressmaker. I mentioned the ringmaster's wife, the circus. So just any form of art. And then again, in the French kitchen, it's the culinary arts. And so it's how art brings people together. It's in the same way that travel or food or music and nature, so many things can bring us together despite our differences. I love to hone in on that. How can art, this human experience, affect all of our experiences? And so, yeah, that's just in a nutshell how I came up with art. And then again, you can kind of see over my shoulder, I'm living it. There's color coded everything in my world. So it's still going on.
That's a great story, Kristy, and that's so wonderful the way you're able to do that, even if you can't use your hands in the traditional way. Well, we're coming up on the end of the hour here, so I want to wrap things up. Before I do, I just want to thank our panelists. This has been awesome. Congratulations on your books. Once again, if anyone wants to check out those books, you can find them at that link or wherever you buy your books, maybe your local indie bookstore. I want to thank everyone for attending. We really appreciate the support that you give us as an independent press just by showing up and hearing these authors speak. If you can't afford to buy the book, get it requested from your local library. Talk about it on social media. Anything and everything helps to get these amazing stories out there. So the last thing I'll ask here before ending the panel is, like, what's the value of historical fiction? I think some of you have kind of covered this already, but Jill, you talked about doing 5 years of research, and Kristy, you talked about Julia Child and all of that source material that you got. So it would be just as easy to write history instead of historical fiction. So what compelled you to say to make it a narrative and to share history that way? Kristy, why don't you start us off?
It's the art of the human experience. It's something that is so rare and so unique. And 100 people could read the same novel and take away something different. And that's the beauty of fiction. That's inserting the emotion that we have. And it's just the human experience, and can't get enough of it. As you can see, we all have books. We all have books behind us.
Heather, how about you?
I think I get a lot of comfort from feeling that, we're standing in a river that's been flowing from the past, and that we're not so different from everybody in the past. I mean, we are and we aren't, but I think that our present culture, the big temptation is to feel that the present is everything. Everything has to be about us now. We live in the most different time ever. It's never happened. And yet we're in so much continuity with human beings in the past. And I kind of love experiencing that.
Yeah, I hear the word unprecedented, nonstop. Everything can't be unprecedented.
Yeah, it's precedented.
Jill, how about you?
Well, I mostly wrote this novel because I love to write, and I really wanted to clear Madame Tingley's name and have people know about her and how wonderful she really did do a lot of wonderful things.
And you feel like you did that?
I feel like I did that. People are really responding in a positive way that, oh, I didn't know that before. And they've heard all the rumors too. So I'm feeling really, really happy that that's how it's coming across.
Nice. And Jillian, how about you? What's the value of historical fiction?
For me, I just have this insatiable curiosity. And if I can't figure out why something happened because there's no record of it, I would like to fill in the gaps with my own imagination. And I think that there's such value in understanding that, like I said, the most common person could have the most remarkable story. And just because they weren't royalty or super famous or um, not loved by masses doesn't mean that we shouldn't remember who they are as a human being. And the same goes for all of us. I mean, as artists ourselves, I think it's so important that we tell people who are readers, like, you have a story that needs to be told as well. And if you have the chance to write down anything important from your life, do it, because there's going to be someone in the future who looks back and says, wow, look at this amazing woman who wrote this historical fiction novel. And that could be about any of the four of us.
Definitely. Well, thanks again to our panelists. Congratulations. And this has been a wonderful conversation. And I want to thank everyone for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone.